Welcome everyone. We are now live for our Khairallah Tarikh series webinar with Dr. Linda Jacobs. We're going to wait a few minutes to give people time to sign on. In the meantime, we're going to listen to some music and then we will start promptly in 2 minutes. Welcome back. And as I said earlier, we have been live for a couple of minutes, but we were giving people some time to log on, and there will be people continuing to sign on after this, but we're going to go ahead and start. So first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Akram Khatir, and I'm a professor of history at North Carolina State University, where I also serve as the director of the Moise Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of Tarikh, our webinar series where we explore the history of the Levant and its diasporas through conversations with outstanding scholars. In these discussions, we hope to gain deeper insights into the history of the Eastern Mediterranean, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, in all of its dimensions, be they political, economic, cultural, environmental, or social, as well as into the diasporas of these communities. Our focus will primarily be on the modern history of this area across the 19th and 20th centuries, but we will certainly make forays into earlier periods as well. If there are particular topics that you would like to hear more about, then please let us know by emailing us at LebaneseStudies@ncsu.edu. Again, Lebanese Studies, one word, at ncsu.edu. Before we begin, I would like to share with you a little bit about our mission at the Khairallah Center, where we are dedicated to research about Lebanese immigrants in the U.S. and throughout the world, and to preserving and sharing that knowledge with the scholarly communities and general public. Please enjoy this short video. It'll be about 2 minutes, and then we'll be back. Now, on behalf of the center, I would like to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. Linda Jacobs, who is one of my favorite historians. Dr. Jacobs has a Ph.D. in Near Eastern Archaeology and Anthropology and has spent many years working on excavations and economic development projects in the Middle East. She serves on the board of several Middle Eastern NGOs, a recognized authority on the early Arab diaspora in the United States. She is the author of 3 books now, the first of which is called Strangers in the West, the Syrian Colony of New York City, 1880 to 1900. And the second edition of that book has just come out in 2023, by the way. The second book is Strangers No More, Syrians in the United States, 1880 to 1900, which came out in 2019. And a forthcoming book, which hopefully will be coming out in very soon. And we will share the link to that book when it comes out. As soon as it comes out, we will send you a link to how you can acquire that book. And this forthcoming book on the early Arab diaspora is called Captivating Strangers, Early Arab Immigrants in the United States. All 4 of her grandparents were members of the 19th century New York Syrian Lebanese Colony. Welcome, Linda. We are so happy
Thank
to.
you. So happy to be here.
Thank you for taking the time to join us, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Now, before we start talking about your new book, Captivating Strangers, Early Arab Immigrants in the United States, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the path you took to become a historian of the early Arab American community in the United States.
Well, it's a story that I've told several times. I was at loose ends after I came back from the Middle East and trying to figure out what I was going to do. And my parents were getting really old, so I started asking them questions about their childhood. And they were raised in Brooklyn, in the Syrian colony in Brooklyn. And I started to hear these repeated myths of the stories that they told, and they kept telling them over and over again. And I realized that I wanted to know more. So I started looking, and I started to find out that there was this central trope of the myth that was missing. There was a hole in the myth, and the myth was the Syrian colony of Manhattan that centered on Washington Street on the Lower West Side of Manhattan in the 19th and 20th century, up until the 1940s, that no one talked about, at least no one that I knew. All my aunts and uncles only talked about Brooklyn. So I decided I needed to find out about the Syrian colony in Manhattan. And that led to the production of my first book in 2015. And when I'm a 3rd-generation Lebanese. So when I tell people about the Manhattan colony in the 19th century, a really vibrant, important, and starting point, and the mother colony for all the colonies and communities in the United States, no one knows about it, which is mysterious and amazing. So it led me to become best friends with all of these 19th century people who were living on Washington Street in Manhattan. And being best friends with them led me to realize that they were moving around the country. There's a very famous map, which I think that the Carnival Center has digitized, I think from the Syrian American Commercial Magazine, of the routes that the Syrians took out of New York and out of New Orleans and out of Boston, covering the entire country. And really, by the mid-1880s, and certainly by 1900, every state and every territory in the United States had Syrian communities. So that was the impetus of my second book. And all of these people intertwined because people moved around. They had relatives in other places. They were always going out, selling things, peddling, coming back. And so the connections in the United States and also in South America and Central America were tight and frequent. So you couldn't avoid starting to think about the other communities in the United States once you started thinking about New York. And then going to the next level, what did these people do in these communities? And what did the myths say and what did they actually do? So I wrote a new book called Captivating Strangers, and it's really a collection of themed chapters trying to understand some of the, I would say, the anomalies of the myth. And maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about the myth, Akram, because it's kind of what we all grew up with, but it's the myth of the penniless person male coming to the United States with no money, no skills, no English, taking a shenta or a jazdan harir on credit, a peddling box, and going out and peddling and earning enough money to start his own business. And that is only a small part of the story. So I'm really interested in looking at those people who didn't fit that stereotype. So that's Captivating Strangers.
And thank you so much for talking about the myth, because I think that's a very important point to make, because it's still very much well and alive. And it's not that there isn't a certain validity and a certain truth to the myth, but certainly the story of these immigrants is far more complex and in many ways far more interesting, one would argue, in that regard. So in some ways, you've already talked about the impetus for writing your latest book, Captivating Strangers. But I was wondering why specifically, and we'll go through this as we go through the PowerPoint images. We'll go through some of these characters that you chose to focus on. But I'm kind of curious as how you went about choosing your subjects. I mean, why is it that they were so captivating to you to the point that you thought you would write chapters about them?
Well, I would sort of turn that around, I guess. I picked people who were very visible. And the reason they were visible is because they were odd in some way. Either they were in trouble, or they were flamboyant, or they were extremely successful, or something like that. So it was kind of a matter of having people be well documented, because there were hundreds of thousands of Syrian diasporic, Syrian, Lebanese, Arabs around the world who don't have much documentation attached to them. And they're as worthy as anyone else of being told about and talked about and studied. But it will take more than what the resources that any one person has to find them. And these people are people, although no one knows about them except me, really, who were well documented in their time. And so they're worthy of being studied because everyone is. They're worthy of being studied because they're so interesting, and they're worthy of being studied because they made the newspapers. They were in the directories. People knew about them at the time. So it made it possible to tell their story. So I don't know if you want to ask another question, but I was thinking that we could go to my two families, because this will kind of give a context for the myth. These are my two families. The one on the left, my paternal family before my father was born. The one on the right, my maternal family before my mother was born. And I use these two families as the embodiment of the myth and the anti-myth of the Syrian immigrant. And I tell the story in my book of not having been, just the very beginning of my research, presenting this story to a group of Lebanese American businessmen and women. And they all got so mad at me. They were all yelling at me at the end because especially the part about my paternal grandfather, who was a failure. economically. He was a recluse. He was depressed. He couldn't support his family. He failed at everything, almost everything he tried to do. And nobody liked the idea of having the word failure in the same sentence with Lebanese. That was just not something that people were ready to accept. So I'm doubling down on that in this book and trying to prove to people that the Syrians were like every other immigrant group. There were people who did well, people who didn't do well. And you have to be willing to talk about everybody. Because again, just because my grandfather was not a successful businessman and wasn't a successful father in many ways, he's worthy of being looked at and documented and written about. So, and those, yeah,
Well,
I made enemies really early.
well, I am completely familiar with that response, others, because I tend to go along the same route that you do, Linda. Um, but you know, in many ways, I mean, the question that this brings up is how are we measuring, you know, success? I mean, what do we define as a community as success? And I'm wondering if you can speak more to that a little bit, because a lot of people, obviously, one of the easy metrics is did they come make money and become, you know, high profile, successful people. But for you as a historian, uh, what does that mean? You know, that they are at least forget the word success because obviously it's a very loaded word, and we can't all agree on it. But what is it that makes them historically worthy to tell their stories? What is it about them that is compelling in some ways?
Well, I mean, that in the case of my paternal grandfather in particular, and this came from the audience, not from me, they said, he gave birth to your father. And that's the success that he had. And that was not just my father. All of his children were successful in their ways. And so and they gave birth to us. And here we are, you know, in the world and in the United States and American citizens and doing whatever we're doing. So, you know, he came here really quite penniless, didn't do well, and still had a family that prospered and
Yeah,
succeeded. Not in his lifetime, but in theirs and their children's lifetime. And so, and that's the story of all of the third generation. Second generation's a little more mixed, but the third generation is really something, you know, we should look back on people like him with pride, I think, and talk
absolutely.
about it.
Absolutely. And I actually, towards the end, I would like to also bring up the amazing project that you're doing as a descendant of your grandfather, and
Okay.
to commemorate the early Arab American community. I would like to reserve a few minutes at the end to perhaps talk about that as well, because I think
Okay.
that speaks to your point. But the other thing is, I think sometimes we also, when we're telling these stories that are very triumphalist in nature, it's like, look how amazing they are because they are amazing. We forget about all the struggles. And in many ways, the struggles make their efforts, even all of them, more impressive. I mean, they're coming to a
Yeah.
country where they didn't speak the language early on, where they are at best, you know, regarded suspiciously, at worst, they're being attacked. It's a very difficult set of circumstances. They're leaving home and family and loved ones, crossing thousands of miles. I mean, it's a journey that is really remarkable in of itself. And so I completely agree with that idea that just simply that he landed and started a family is a measure of success. But perhaps we can talk about the Jacob, you know, the Jbara family, which is the other side of the coin, I suppose.
Yeah. So my grandfather, Fayyad, who was called Fred in the United States, was by most measures a success. But when you talk about success, at least in the first generation of the Syrian diaspora, he wasn't Andrew Carnegie. You know, he was not the Shinazi brothers who had a huge cigarette and tobacco business in Manhattan in the 19th century. No, his success was modest. But this idea of the triumphalism has attached to him, at least in our family. They talk about his chauffeur-driven Packard. They talk about the salons that he had on Sunday where he invited all the intelligentsia to his home. They talk about him traveling to all over the world and importing linens, which is what he did for a living. Well, in fact, his success was modest. he was a middle class, maybe edging up toward upper middle class man. He raised his family well. All of his kids got educated, unlike my paternal grandfather's family, where the first 5 of the 7 couldn't afford to go to college. So there were only 2 that went to college, and the only reason they went to college was because they were supported by their sisters, because their father and mother could not do that. And my maternal grandfather sent all of his kids either to finishing school or to college, and they also gave birth to us again, you know. So the difference between them was not that great, but my maternal grandfather, seen as the paragon of success, and my paternal grandfather ignored, really, you know. So for me, it's a really, both of them are myth busting relatives for me. But really, you know, knowing the Syrian community, that the 19th century Syrian community as I do, again, nobody was an Andrew Carnegie in that generation. It took one generation down for people to become quite successful. So
Financially speaking, that is.
I'm financially, yeah.
I'm kind of curious,
So
before we go on to the next subject of your investigation in this book. I also,
yeah,
you mentioned very quickly that your maternal grandfather on Sundays would bring together the intelligentsia. So a lot of times we don't really focus on that labor, the kind of labor that it takes to bring together people, including the women who are working to create the environment that brings people together as a community to sit around, have something to drink, have something to eat, and talk. And so that kind of, that kind of building of a community is usually very opaque. We don't see it. So I'm kind of curious if you talk a little bit about if you have encountered any descriptions of these kind of, salons, intellectual salon, on Sundays.
yes. And so the part from my family stories, and maybe we could go to the next slide because we can sort of fuse the women into this. So one of the really important chapters in this book are 3 women who broke every stereotype of Syrian women in the diaspora in the United States. And I talk about each of them. Each of them had her success, and each one was incredibly successful and well documented, unlike most Syrian women who were, as soon as they stopped peddling, and even during, I mean, even while they were peddling, they're very, very, very undocumented. You do not find them in very often in city directories. You don't find them in newspapers. You don't find them in court cases very often. You don't find them on naturalization documents because they took their naturalizations from their husbands or their fathers, but usually their husbands. So they are the secret sauce of the Syrian community that never gets talked about. So these 3 women were exceptions because they were either in trouble with the law or very successful businesswomen and did enough so that they were in these documents that you don't usually find them in. One of them, who's not this woman, but one of the other women, is Marie Aziz, who came with her sister and her parents in 1891 to New York. And through a series of tragedies in her family, she took over her father's jewelry business in 1905 and became a very, very, very successful, sophisticated jewelry designer and producer. She was one of the only women who worked with precious stones in the United States at that time. And she had a store on Fifth Avenue and 46th Street. She sold thousands and thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. In 1914, a woman had all of her jewelry stolen, and they described and that was all from Marie Aziz, and they described these necklaces made of pave diamonds that surrounded her neck. And the stolen jewelry was worth $50,000, which is like $1 million now. So, and so to get to your point about the intelligentsia, her will was contested by one of the members of the Rabita al-Kalamiyya, the Pen Bond, the Pen League. because she had hired him to translate letters to her from Khalil Gibran, from Arabic into English. And he had done the work, but it had never been published, but she had not paid him. And she died, and he was trying to claim his pay. And he talked about coming to her house with all the members of the Rabita al-Kalamiyya 3 to 4 times a month. She would serve them Syrian food. She would serve them Syrian coffee. They'd talk in Arabic and English and talk about intellectual and literary ideas. And she herself had been a writer in the 19th century when she was still a girl. She wrote for many of the Arabic newspapers and then had to give it up to take over her father's jewelry business when he died. So it gives just a little bit of a glimpse of the way people kept their culture alive. She was completely focused toward the elite of New York, the New York society. She was as American as they came. Well, really not American, because she spoke with a British accent. She went to British school in Lebanon, so she spoke with a British accent, but her clientele were all the haute monde of New York City in the 19th and 20th century. And yet she kept her Syrian culture alive by having these salons 3 to 4 times a week in her apartment in New York. So.
And what about Sophie Shisham?
Oh, she's one of my favorites. She broke the mold in every way. She was a smuggler. And she was married at the age of 13 in Lebanon to a man who was 30 years her senior, who had a son. And they came to the United States in the late 1880s, and then her family followed her. She became what I call a lady of the road. She traveled around the United States by herself, selling Syrian, Middle Eastern goods. And her husband stayed at home and ran a boarding house on Washington Street. And after not very many years, in 1894, she went to Oklahoma Territory, because it was like Reno, Nevada was in the 50s. It was a place where you could get a divorce quickly in 90 days. She went to Oklahoma Territory, found a lawyer, spent the 90 days peddling, and then got divorced from Tanus, and then married a person that probably everyone on this call is familiar with, Naum Mokarzel. And she married Naum, but they got involved in a scandal because they were thought to have been living together before they were married. And so they moved to Philadelphia, which is where Naum started El Huda. And they moved to Philadelphia to get away from the scandal in New York. But all during before she married Naum, she was smuggling goods all over the United States, and she became, I just made a mistake. Excuse me, I'm really sorry.
All right.
So I need to back up. She was not smuggling, she was peddling. I'm saying the wrong word. So she and Naum got married. They moved to Philadelphia, and Naum divorced her after 5 years. And so she was left on her own again. So she took money that she had saved herself, started peddling again, went to California and opened a retail store in Los Angeles in 1903, and then started buying property. And all of her family, she had a huge extended family. They all came to California, and they had 2 retail stores. She had a Venetian lace factory, and she imported things from all over the world. And then she and a new husband, her third, moved to Hawaii and bought property on Waikiki Beach and set up this vacation cottages, and she made a fortune. And she and her husband lived in Hawaii until her husband committed suicide quite early. She went on for another 50 years and supported herself with all of her real estate investments, and then she ended up retiring to California and dying, not a wealthy woman, but supporting herself until 1964. I mean, she was incredible. And then the third woman is the one I started, is the smuggler who was married to a very successful merchant named John Abdel Noor. And she and he had a huge smuggling business. She took all the risk. She was the one who was arrested. She did all the smuggling. He provided her with the goods to smuggle. And she was indicted over and over again. She was caught over and over again. But the number of times she wasn't caught provided them with a fantastic living. And they lived like, as the newspaper said, like a Shah and his wife and his princess in Greenwich Village in New York City. And, again, this is not what you think of as Syrian womanhood. It's really incredible. Yeah.
That is really quite an amazing story altogether.
Yeah.
There was a question, and I think to a certain extent you kind of answered it, in which they were asking if you could speak more about your grandmothers. So I don't know if you would like to do that a little bit before we go on to the next slide.
So my paternal grandmother was Greek Orthodox, and she married my grandfather, who was Maronite. Everybody knows what Maronite is, I guess, Catholic, Lebanese Catholic. I discovered, and she was married at the age of 14 to a man she didn't really know, but he had met her in Putnam, Connecticut, through her parents. And her parents were also not very successful economically. And they married her to him apparently because she was pregnant, which meant that she got pregnant at the age of 13. And whether she was pregnant by my grandfather or someone else, we don't know. But the tragic part about that was that they married and the baby was born 2 months later and died 11 months later. And my grandfather as part of this definition of him as not being very successful, he would open a fruit stand in Philadelphia. He would fail at it. They'd move to Connecticut. He'd do something else. They'd fail at it. So his first 5 children were born in 5 different states. And she, according to my father, was the one who kept the family together. She was the strong hand. She was the person who got her kids to college, the 2 that went to college. She got her daughters out working early, and she kept them together. And my father talks about this photograph and said that every piece of clothing in this photograph, except for the men's suits, were made by my grandmother. Wow. Because they didn't have the money to buy at a store. So that's the other part of the Syrian myth that is really, I think, true, that there were these women who held the families together.
Okay. Do you want to go on to the next slide, Linda?
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
So this is one of the chapters that's so much fun. This is about Carnival, Syrian Carnival impresarios. A group of people came to the 1893 Columbian Fair in Chicago. It was the big attraction for Lebanese Syrian people in the 19th century. And H.H. Jessup, who is a Protestant missionary who many of you have heard of because he was very well known, associated with Syrian Protestant College, all the intellectual elites of the mid-19th century in Beirut. He complained bitterly to his friends about all of these people who had been infected with gold fever and that they were thinking that they were going to go to the 1893 Chicago Fair and make their fortunes. And people left in droves. And I've started collecting ship manifests, transcribing the names of people who were coming to the fair from the Middle East. And I've counted so far, I've written down so far 750 who came in the month of April, 1893 alone to New York, and then went on to Chicago. And there were many more than that. And Lebanese were everywhere at the Chicago Fair, everywhere. And they learned very quickly from seeing the audience reactions that Middle Eastern entertainment was a moneymaker. And the more exotic you presented yourself, the better, the better the income. And so people took away this lesson from the Chicago Fair and began to set up first acrobatic, small theater, vaudeville, carnival performances, and then became impresarios where they fielded carnivals all over the United States. Then they started out showing Oriental, and I put Oriental in quotes, but that's what they called it, Oriental acts. They'd have belly dancers, they'd have sword fighters, they'd have acrobats, they'd have people dressed up in costume, they'd have wild animals, because Middle Eastern natives were thought to understand wild animals better than other people. And then they became the quintessential American carnies. And they threw off all the Oriental stuff and became carnival impresarios. People like KG Barkut, who's here in the cart. You can see he's got his own train cars. He was huge. He had 20 train cars filled with people and animals going from town to town 7 months a year. He had 20 people working as his core staff, and then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acts and entertainment going with him from place to place. He had the first motorized, that is in cars and trucks. He had the first motorized carnival in the United States. And American carnival impresarios called him the father of Oriental carnivals in the United States, as he started out that way. So he was one of the incredible carnival impresarios, and there were many others. Hattie is the woman who's holding the white horse, and Hattie's sister is standing on, his wife is Hattie, and her sister is standing on the stairs. But the cover of my book is the one Syrian acrobatic troupe. It's Amin Abu Hamid, who came from Brumana. And yeah, in the center, Amin is what they call the understander, and he's the strong man who holds the pyramid above him. But his nephew, who's the little boy on the left, who's hanging on the left, became a carnival impresario. And then he went on to own the biggest entertainment pier in Atlantic City and about half of Atlantic City in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And he was incredibly successful. And his grandson owns a circus in Atlantic City today. And they travel 7 months a year. So, I mean, the carnival impresarios were quite incredible. And they did both circuses and outdoor carnivals, so that they had a market that stretched for 7 or 8 months a year. So that's another set of people who were, and they were in all the newspapers because they were traveling around. They understood publicity, they understood marketing, and that is what kept their audiences coming in. So
just for those of you who are with us, I just want to also mention that Linda, we collaborated with Linda on a project a while ago now. It's in 2020, really. It's called Turath, which in Arabic means heritage. And I put in the chat the link to it, turath2020.org. And in that, we focus on the Chicago World Fair, as well as these performers. And these people go around performing. And there's a whole, as Linda has written, and we've also done a lot of work on them, it's not only just acrobatics, but people actually are going around on the lecture circuit. So there's a whole people that go around, male and female. One of the most prominent is a woman by the name, she called herself Princess Rahmi Haidar. And she was quite a performer. Anyway, so this is really, there's a very strong tradition of this kind of making a living as performers, and we'd invite you to go look to the exhibit. So perhaps now we can go on to the next slide and
yes. So this is one of the joys of doing this kind of history. I was writing this chapter on Freemasonry, and because there was the only Syrian Masonic lodge ever founded in the United States was founded by the New York community in 1908. And it's a very interesting history, and it only closed in 2016, which was about 5 minutes before I started studying them. And so it was kind of sad for me that they had closed, but I did meet some members of that were still that are still alive, that were part of the community. But in doing this research and starting to look at Syrians and Freemasonry, I discovered the person that I think is the earliest Syrian immigrant to settle in the United States, and that's this man, Peter Zacharias, or Zacharias. I don't know how he pronounced his name because I've never heard it said. And he came to the United States. He was born in Damascus, spent time in Beirut, spent time in Cambridge, England studying, and then came to the United States, to California for the gold rush in 1852.
Oh, wow.
And he settled in Sacramento after mining for gold in a small town in the north of California. And then he settled in Sacramento and lived out his life in Sacramento, married a Scottish immigrant. And he was better educated than 99.9% of the people who were living in Sacramento at the time. And yet what he did was he was essentially a janitor. And he was a janitor for two things. One is he was a janitor, they called them tilers, for a dozen Masonic and fraternal organizations in California. And he was a janitor for a church, for the school system, for a commercial building, for, he cobbled together this living. I can't really understand why. He was extremely well educated. He wrote a hand like an elegant hand. He could have been a lawyer. He could have been anything. And he was a janitor all of his life. On the left is him in 1868. And on the right is him in all of his Masonic splendor in 1878, just before he died. For me, the really poignant part of his life is that he spent his entire life as a Mason. He gave every piece of property that he owned, he gave to the Masons. And yet he never made it beyond the position of Tyler, which is the janitor of the Masonic Lodge, which was the lowest position in the lodge. And the only thing I can think of is that he was seen, because he was Syrian, he was seen more of a mascot than an equal. But it was his life. He had the highest degree in the York Rite. He had the highest degree in the Scottish Rite. He was a member of the Odd Fellows as well. He founded a lodge, a kind of franchise lodge for women of the Odd Fellows as well. He became the Grand Tyler of California, but he never made it beyond. And I keep calling him this janitor. So that's the kind of double experience I think that people had in the United States. Again, he was the best educated person in Sacramento probably, and never used it.
Well, I mean, I think it kind of, what you're saying jives to a certain extent with even current situations when you have people who are either as refugees or as immigrants coming in, and they may have been doctors, engineers,
Right.
teachers, and they arrive in an environment in the United States or other places in Western Europe, perhaps, where they're not recognized, their education is not recognized, their abilities are recognized. And I think, quite frankly, I mean, the element of race comes into play. We've seen it amongst Arab Americans, early Arab Americans. So I'm sure it's partly that. And California, as you know better than anybody, Linda, at the time was quite in the midst of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian race, including riots and lynching. So I think that kind of element really would have been cast against him.
But on the other hand, these early Masonic lodges accepted him. He was actually in 3 Masonic lodges in the United States, and his home lodge was in Paris. And because Syrians were considered white by both the authorities and by the newspapers and by people. He could not have done it without his probably British accent, his extremely good English, and his whiteness.
Yeah,
But
and I think
there,
the issue of
but
white,
there was a ceiling for
yeah.
him.
Well, I mean, true, and also I think the issue of whiteness doesn't really get resolved till, as you see from Sarah Gualtieri's work, till
Right,
the
from 1909.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, and even then after
yeah,
that idea. So I think at that point it wouldn't have necessarily been something that was that common. But
yeah.
so let me before I go on, because somebody was asking about the name of the Carnival family in Atlantic City. So I was wondering if you can give that name again, and perhaps I would type it.
Yeah, so it's Hamid. I call him Hamid, but he calls himself Hamid. It's Hamid Circus. And I can find the URL at some point and give it, you can send it out. Um, he's from a circus family, and his wife is fifth generation circus as well.
Okay.
And their kids are circus. They're really interesting. Yeah.
And they are still going on right now in Atlantic City?
Yeah, they travel all over the country, just like their his great grandfather did. Yeah, yeah,
So I'm kind of curious about something, Linda. As
yeah,
you're doing this research, clearly you went to public records. You talked about newspapers, about ship manifests. You're talking about city directories. I mean, you are a remarkable researcher by any measure. But I'm kind of curious if you were able to access family papers and even family oral histories amongst these people. I mean, and I'm wondering how they reflected upon their ancestors, about the people that came before them. Like this Peter Zachariah or Zacharias, however he pronounced his name. Obviously, did he have any children, grandchildren? Do they know
no,
the story? No.
yeah, no, no. So I don't seek out people, descendants, but they seek me out.
Okay.
And so once they seek me out, if they have a story to tell, I mean, I do research for people for free because it's fun to do it, but I'm usually too busy to do it. But if they have a story to tell, that I find interesting, then so for Jim Hammond, for example, who runs the circus now, I went down there thinking that I would talk to him for half an hour and, look at his family papers and then walk away. And we talked for 5.5. He talked for 5.5 hours. I couldn't, I couldn't stop. It was incredible. He's got a kind of jaundiced view of this line of descent. Partly because, as in every family, or maybe not in every family, but certainly in my family, there was lots of dissension, lots of jealousy, lots of people suing each other for things. And so he was not, he not very, not, it wasn't that he wasn't willing, but he kind of thought it was funny that I was writing that I was so fascinated, and I thought this guy was so incredible. And he just thought he was like any person, involved in fights and jealousy and stuff like that. So, but, somebody should write a complete biography of all of these people. That's
Yeah.
what I always say. Yeah, yeah,
It's kind of interesting because one of the people that I think we haven't had a full biography of yet is Naum Karzil, who is also an incredible character in many ways.
yeah,
And I think you mentioned something here that I think is important. In many ways, they're full humanity, they're full three-dimensionality as people come
right.
through with their passions. When they're angry, when they're not perfect, when they are, stealing money or getting into familiar arguments or estrangement or what have you. And I think it's that element that really renders them fully human. That these are people that, weren't just immigrant or Syrian. They are really just like a human being that has all these elements to them. And I think it's
Yeah.
really a lot of your work
And I'm sorry.
and a lot of your work brings that out, which is what I love about your writing.
And one of the sources for that is really court cases, because it's the only place where you actually hear their voices in
Yeah.
those days, obviously. And even though the English is terrible, the transcriptions are terrible, the translations are terrible, you hear their voices, and they're under stress in these court cases. And so and there aren't enough of them yet. I mean, I've pulled out some, but there aren't enough of them yet. But really, it's just fascinating to read court cases for that very reason. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, that is actually very interesting. There was one case that came out of the textile fire in New York City of a factory owned by a Syrian, and the person was being accused
Oh,
of setting the fire themselves, and a
oh,
really interesting thing. But perhaps another source is that the Arabic press itself sometimes carried stories of fights within the community, big arguments.
right. Oh, right. That's
Those are
true.
very rich sources as well. One
Yeah.
question we have before we move on is that the question is, did immigrants from this area we call Syria or Greater Syria, which is really today's Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, did they interact with indigenous peoples, Native Americans, and are there any documented stories or images? So in your research, have you seen any of these encounters?
Well, yeah, in two places. One is the Carnival impresarios and the acrobats, because they worked with Buffalo Bill and they worked in the Wild West shows. And Buffalo Bill was known, and Pawnee Bill as well, were known for having Native Americans in their Wild West shows. And they were all, I mean, Buffalo Bill and Pawnee Bill employed Native Americans throughout the whole history of these Wild West shows. And the Arabs and we can talk about this now or later, the Arabs were mostly in those Wild West shows were mostly from North Africa. They weren't Lebanese or Syrian. Only the guy on the cover of my book was the exception to that in terms of a Syrian acrobatic troupe that worked with Buffalo Bill. But so these are the Berbers from Morocco. They're in the Si Ben Ali's Berber troupe, and they were on their way. They were extras in a Broadway play. This is 1912. They're walking up Broadway in full costume, you notice. And they worked as well as in vaudeville and in Broadway plays, and later in the movies, in the silent movies. They were also in these Wild West shows. So they worked very hard. And Abu Hamid, the man whose great grandson owns the circus, worked for Buffalo Bill for years and years. And George, his nephew, who came when he was 8, was taught to read by Annie Oakley. If everyone knows who Annie Oakley is, she was a sharpshooter in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And Buffalo Bill himself, Buffalo Bill Cody, took George Hamid under his wing and put him in the first act of the Wild West show. And so George, the boy, knew lots of Native Americans as well. The other encounter that I know about are doctors who worked not on Native American reservations, but out in the middle of nowhere where their patients were Native Americans. And so there were several Syrian doctors who worked in North Dakota and in Rapids, South Dakota, and in other places who had Native American patients. So those are the only two examples I know of right now.
Back to that question, I think I would add something. So if you look at
Yes,
like New Mexico or Arizona or South Dakota and North Dakota, we have, and there's a particular book called Los Arabes of New Mexico.
yeah,
That is a really
that's right.
excellent work, and it does document in which at least some families, for example, in North Dakota, I think the Abu Rizq family, they had these stores that were at the edge of the
That's
reservation.
right.
And so we have some
Yeah,
documentation, which there are these Syrian merchants that would set up stores to serve both the needs of the folks living within the reservation, but also they would sell the wares, the potteries and the weavings and the various artifact handicrafts that Native Americans did. But there's not enough research that has been done on this. I think this is a very rich area, but of course, finding the material on it is going to be a bit challenging. Uh,
right.
but perhaps now we can shift to the Ben Ali Berber Theater a little bit more, Linda, since this is one of our last slides. Could you talk a little bit more about these folks?
Yeah, so the North African acrobats were incredible. They came long before the Civil War. I've documented them back to 1846. Uh, Lucien Seymour, who's a Moroccan historian, has dated them a little bit earlier, but we're arguing about that right now. And they were hired not out of Morocco, but out of Manchester, England. So there was a long history before 1846 where they were traveling to England and being in circuses, English circuses. By the time the Americans got to them, which was the 1840s, they were proficient in English, at least the leaders were. They knew how to deal with foreign agents and foreign managers, and they were brought over in 1846. The first Arabs to come over were with a circus called Howe's Circus. And Howe's Circus was, he was actually British, but he had a big American presence as well. And they performed some of the things like the pyramid that you see on the cover of my book. They did those pyramids. They were sword fighters. They were tumblers. They did back flips and that kind of thing. And so in the summers, they were under tents, but essentially outdoors. And then in the winters, they were unemployed. So they had to either go back to Morocco or figure out how to make a living in the winter. And so they went on to vaudeville stages. So you see them in vaudeville stages, and they always had an American agent very early. They lived in Greenwich Village. They would have it because the vaudeville theaters started out on 14th Street. They would have an American agent, but soon they performed all through the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, their leaders started to become known by their names. Before that, they were anonymous, but after the Civil War, the names of their leaders became known, and they became their own managers and their own agents. And they set up offices in New York City, and they brought over people from Morocco, whom they either trained here and eventually had schools in Morocco training acrobats. And they farmed out their troops to anybody who would take them. So, as I said, Broadway shows, circuses, carnivals, vaudeville shows, private parties, anybody who would hire them. And not just in the United States, a whole group of them went to Australia in 1892. They worked for Barnum and Bailey. They worked for all the circuses. They worked for the Wild West shows. They worked at the Columbian 1893 fair, simultaneously with working for Buffalo Bill. They were amazingly successful. And if you have the patience, if you watch Douglas Fairbanks' silent movie, The Thief of Baghdad, which I think was 1922, see Ben Ali's Berbers are all the extras. Oh, yeah. And Haji Sharif, who was one of the original acrobats who became an impresario himself, was the whirling dervish in The Thief of Baghdad. So you see these guys who came in the 19th century who were, now in silent film. And the other person who was fascinated with this was Thomas Edison. So he became friends with some of these acrobats, and he filmed Haji Tahar and Haji Sharif, two of the acrobats from North Africa, in his Black Maria studio in New Jersey in 1895. And they're in the Library of Congress collections. So this is what they were doing. They're walking up Broadway in their costumes, and the story about them is that they're about to encounter for the first time, because they're going to lunch, they're about to encounter for the first time a knife and fork. Of course, it's completely untrue, but you really can see Ben Ali telling the reporter this, because exoticizing oneself and making oneself as exotic as possible meant that more people came to see them. So
this has been truly amazing, and we are almost out of time. I wish we had a lot more time. I have some questions that we're not going to be able to answer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy them, and then I'm going to send them to you, Linda, with the names, and see if you can possibly answer those, and I can share it later.
okay.
I am going to just take a moment here to thank everybody. But before I do that, we have a couple of minutes, at least 1 minute. Linda, if you can talk a little bit about what are you doing in terms of the commemoration of Arab al-Qalamiyya and early Arab American intellectuals.
So we're putting up a public art installation in New York City, steps away from the Syrian colony on Washington Street, to honor the writers and poets of the early 20th century Syrian colony. And we hope that it will be unveiled in mid-2025. Was that a minute?
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah.
So unfortunately, much as I would like to go on for another hour or two, we have to wrap up. So first of all, thank you, Linda, for taking the time, not only to speak about
Pleasure.
today, but for all your amazing research and brilliant writing that brings to life this long lost history. And it's really making this such an, important resource for a lot of people.
Thank you.
And I want to thank those who participated with us in this conversation. I am sorry we didn't get to all your questions. We hope that you have enjoyed today's episodes, although I'm pretty sure you did, because of Linda, of course. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter or social media, please take a moment to do so now, so that you can always stay informed of events like this webinar. And we usually host about 3 every semester. We also would like to remind everybody that while our work here at the Khairallah Center and the work of people like Linda, who has been an inspiration to us, is really vital to maintaining the history of our community, this work takes a lot of effort, a lot of hours, a lot of equipment. And so we always appreciate if you would be willing to donate one time or even subscribe monthly to help support the work we do, not only to continue to build our archive that is available to everybody, not only to help us tell stories about the early Arab American community, but also to bring people like Linda who are really bringing this history to life. So I thank you so much for being with us today. We wish you all a good day and see you next time.
Thank you.